you had a controversial reel pop off taken from our last episode.
You brought up the statistic that a fourth of women will be in their lifetime. I read the same thing before I went to university, that a fourth of women would be on my college campus in the 4 years that they were there. The problem with these statistics is that they aren't true. When you look at the surveys that people do in this area, they've expanded the definition of what is. So while you still see in your head violent crime when you hear the word, actually, what a lot of these things are covering are things like pressure from a boyfriend to have sex, which is of course really bad, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but it's not what we all have in our brains when we think of this word.
What did you think to the backlash on that? Maybe it's worth you giving a bit more context as well on it, but how did you deal with those comments? Did they upset you?
So I think for a long time I've been probably a bit rogue on this particular topic, and often the way these statistics work. I mean, a lot of the comments were, "What study is this? And how do you know that it's not true?" and such things. A lot of the time, these aren't just studies. These are narratives. This is the way it is spoken about in society. I mean, since then, I've read many an article that argues that 1/3 of women have been sexually assaulted, that, or sometimes it's a fifth. It actually doesn't really matter what the number is, as long as it's really, really high. And this is kind of the point. So I think, there's kind of some of that where maybe someone wants to challenge me on my factual accuracy. And I think I can take that challenge. The other really interesting thing was the number of people and comments with a lot of likes about how the only reason I could be saying this must be because I had a bad experience in my past and that I don't want to confront my own inner psychological trauma.
You don't want to put a definition on it, so you want to stretch it away from what would encompass your experience.
I basically don't want to admit that I've been raped, and this is what's really going on. And I think this kind of psychological projection onto people who have different opinions to you is just really lazy. And everyone can psychoanalyze each other to death, but that's not going to change what we think about each other. And I think we have a kind of tendency in society to really value kind of lived experience as the main reason that anyone could be credible on anything. And ironically, most of the time people are supposed to be credible if they've been assaulted. But in my case, because this was supposed to somehow discredit me, depending on what the position that the person holds is. There was often this comes up in kind of sexual assault cases or not in cases, but in debates where you'll end up having a kind of pseudo-humorous, and it shouldn't be humorous thing, but where people on either side of an argument about whether a campaign was good or whether something or other say, I am a survivor and I think it was a good campaign, or I am a survivor and I think it's a bad campaign. You can kind of, you don't want to laugh about it. But the more serious thing is that this kind of says that the only way you would be allowed to engage in a political discussion about sexual assault is not only that you must have had the experience, but also that you're willing to share it with the world. I mean, this idea that we might want to keep things private and that we can argue our political positions irrespective of what our personal experiences are, and that doesn't mean that we have or have not had those experiences. But I think we've lost the ability to kind of say, actually, it's totally fine and should not be expected that you put your past traumas on the table before you engage in any sort of political argument. I think this is really problematic for the direction political discourse is kind of going in, not only because it puts a big burden on people who've been victims of various crimes, but also because it creates this very warped power structure where someone is either trustworthy or not on the basis of something that has happened to them, not on the basis of how good their arguments are or what they know. So I think it's overall very destructive. And I think it is a kind of breakdown of the idea of the private and public life, where I think politics, podcasting, all these things, me going on your show, should not at all have anything to do with my private, what I do in private. This is how you're allowed to have a public expression and a private life, and not share that private life or want everyone to know about it.
Well, I think what that reel touched on was something so interesting, which is like morality versus what should actually be law. And I don't know, we kind of, on one hand, we have this predilection for thinking like, if something's immoral, then it should be illegal. But then on the other hand, in certain cases, we kind of think the complete opposite. So it's like, it's this super muddy thing. And one of the common pushbacks I saw in the comments on this was people kind of just being like, okay, yeah, the definition of what is rape versus sexual assault, it might have been stretched slightly and exaggerated to scare people more or for whatever reason. But surely that's a good thing, that we hold people to higher standards. And if some sexual assaults that are also disgusting are counted as rapes, like maybe that's a trade-off we should take, because we should have such high standards. That was like one of the most common pushbacks I saw in the comments.
Yeah, but I think this really devalues what sexual assault is. And I think the consequence of this kind of thinking, because obviously this came with the Me Too movement. And since then, universities especially have put policies in place that kind of are supposed to then deal with the sexual assault epidemic on campus. And I think what this really does is that it forgets the distinction between violent assaults and like bad experiences, so much so that a university thinks that it's adequate to deal with sexual assault through a university complaints procedure, which you like go online and write a complaint like you would about an essay that you think you got a bad mark on. I think it's a really problematic, the stretching of the term doesn't actually change anything about what's going on. It only changes our perception of how wrong it then is. Because if in our head, sexual assault is someone, being a bit, kissing you without asking them or these kinds of things, then we actually do devalue what sexual assault is. And even if you say that it's still just as problematic, you don't actually think that. And therefore, the kind of solution to someone having been assaulted is also watered down. And things are just, assumed to be able to be treated by these bodies. I mean, at my university, you can anonymously report a sexual assault, and it will be used for kind of campus statistics, even though it's unverified and it's not and it's anonymous. But not only is this then supposed to be somehow an kind of affirmation that we kind of think that your assault is valid, or I don't know what that is supposed to do. If you are a victim of a crime, then we should be, empowering people and telling people that they should go to the police with it, much as that might be a horrible experience. But if you think that someone has done something illegal to you, then it is our moral responsibility, both to ourselves and to the rest of the world, to get criminals locked up. I think, therefore, it is a big problem if we blur the lines between what is a crime and what is a complaint and what is just normal human interaction.